The forest always felt like home to me, a sanctuary from the chaos of everyday life. This time, I had decided to spend a day and night alone, capturing the serene beauty through the lens of my film camera. I wasn't afraid. Camping in the wilderness was second nature to me. The only sounds were the whispers of the wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot. As the sun began to set, I set up my small tent and settled in for the night. Morning came quietly, the dawn light filtering through the fabric of my tent. I packed up my gear and made my way back home, eager to develop the photos I had taken. The first few reels were filled with stunning shots of trees, grasses, and the forest bathed in golden sunlight. But as I developed the last reel, a chill ran down my spine. The photos were all of me, asleep in my tent. Peaceful, undisturbed, but captured in perfect clarity. Someone or something had been watching me, silently taking pictures while I slept. I didn't know who or what it could have been, but the thought of it sent shivers down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe a prankster or another camper who had wandered by. But deep down, I knew I had been alone. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling, and after a few restless nights, I knew I had to go back. I had to find out what had been taking those pictures. Armed with my camera, a flashlight, and a sense of determination, I returned to the forest. The same path, the same spot, the same tent. But this time, I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I set up my tent and waited. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I tried to focus on the natural beauty around me, but my mind kept drifting back to those photos. Who had taken them, and why? As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals, the creak of branches swaying in the wind. I sat in the entrance of my tent, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the trees. Hours passed, and just as I began to think I had been imagining things, I saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, too fast to be an animal, too silent to be a person. My heart pounded in my chest as I lifted my camera, trying to focus on the dark figure. But it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me in the oppressive silence of the forest. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. As dawn broke, I packed up my tent and made my way back, feeling no closer to answers than before. But I knew I had to return. Whatever was out there, I needed to know. I needed to understand. Days turned into nights filled with restless sleep and a sense of dread that wouldn't let go. I developed the new set of photos, hoping to catch a glimpse of what I had seen, but all I found were more shots of the forest. Still, the unease grew, gnawing at me. I couldn't let it go. I had to go back to that forest, and this time, I needed to be prepared. I packed more carefully this time. A sturdy knife, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a trail camera to set up outside my tent. My friends thought I was crazy, but they didn't understand. This wasn't just about the photos anymore. It was about facing whatever had been out there, watching me. I arrived at the forest with a sense of determination and trepidation. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. Every sound was amplified, making my nerves jangle. I found the same spot and set up my tent, this time placing the trail camera discreetly on a nearby tree. As the sun set, I sat in my tent, listening to the forest come alive. Hours passed in tense silence. I heard the usual sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but nothing out of the ordinary. I started to relax, thinking maybe it had all been in my head. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like a camera shutter. My heart raced as I slowly unzipped my tent and peered outside. The trail camera was flashing, capturing something just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I crept out of the tent, knife in hand, and moved towards the camera, every step feeling like a lifetime. I reached the camera and saw the photos displayed on the small screen. They showed a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible, watching my tent. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The forest was silent, still. I grabbed the camera and rushed back to my tent, my hands shaking as I reviewed the photos. The figure was human-like, but something was off. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs too long. It stood there, just watching, unmoving. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it had been there the whole time, waiting. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every noise sending my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and left, feeling defeated and more terrified than ever. I developed the new photos, hoping for some clarity, but they only confirmed what I had seen. I needed answers. I couldn't go back alone. I called my friend Mark, an experienced hiker who had always been skeptical of my stories. He agreed to come with me, more out of curiosity than belief. We planned for the next weekend, and as the days passed, I prepared myself mentally and physically. The day arrived, and Mark and I set off into the forest. He joked and laughed, trying to lighten the mood, but I could see the concern in his eyes. As we reached the campsite, the sun was already setting. We set up our tents side by side, and I placed the trail camera in the same spot. Night fell, and we sat by the campfire talking quietly. Mark's presence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, the darkness deeper than before. We decided to take shifts keeping watch, just in case. My turn came and I sat by the dying fire, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the trees. Hours passed, and just as I was about to wake Mark, I heard it again. The soft clicking of a camera. I nudged Mark awake, and we both peered into the darkness, flashlights cutting through the shadows. Nothing. The forest was silent. We checked the trail camera and found more photos of the figure, closer this time. Mark's skepticism vanished, replaced by a look of genuine fear. We decided to stay awake together, the fire our only comfort against the oppressive darkness. As dawn approached, the forest remained eerily quiet. We packed up and left, both of us shaken. On the way back, Mark insisted we needed to report this to the authorities, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. A tall, shadowy figure watching us in the forest didn't exactly sound convincing. Back home, I developed the latest photos. The figure was clearer now, its features more distinct. Its face was pale, almost luminescent, with eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The thought made my skin crawl. I knew I couldn't stay away. Something was drawing me back, a need to understand, to confront whatever was out there. I spent the next few days researching local legends and stories, hoping to find some clue. What I found was more unsettling than I could have imagined. I pored over books and online forums, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The locals had plenty of stories about the forest, tales of a creature they called the Watcher. They described it as an ancient guardian, a spirit that watched over the forest and punished those who trespassed. But the descriptions were vague, filled with contradictions. Some said it was benevolent, others swore it was malevolent. One story in particular caught my attention. It spoke of a group of hikers who had gone missing in the forest decades ago. Their bodies were never found, but their abandoned campsite was discovered, with one eerie detail: photographs of the hikers asleep, taken by someone or something unseen. The Watcher, the story said, had taken them. I couldn't let it go. I had to go back, and this time, I had to do it alone. Mark tried to talk me out of it, but I was determined. I needed answers, and I couldn't put anyone else in danger. I returned to the forest, the sense of foreboding heavier than ever. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches like skeletal fingers. I set up my tent in the same spot, placing the trail camera in its usual position. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the trees, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Night fell, and I sat by the small fire, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs putting me on edge. The forest felt alive, like it was watching, waiting. I tried to stay calm, But my mind kept drifting to the photos, to the stories of the Watcher. Then, just as I was beginning to think nothing would happen, I heard it. The soft, rhythmic clicking of a camera shutter. My heart pounded as I slowly turned, flashlight in hand. I saw nothing, just darkness pressing in around the circle of firelight. But the clicking continued, moving around me, always just out of sight. I stood, knife in hand, and moved toward the sound. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The clicking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the darkness itself. I backed toward my tent, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. I swung the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of a tall, thin figure. Its limbs were too long, its face a pale blur. It watched me with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as it moved closer, the firelight flickering off its strange, almost translucent skin. I stumbled back, falling into my tent. The figure stopped, just outside the ring of light, and I could see it more clearly now. It was humanoid, but not human. Its eyes were dark voids, its mouth a thin, lipless line. It raised a long, bony hand and pointed at me, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, into the light. I saw its face clearly now, a twisted mask of bone and sinew, its eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. It was inside my tent now, looming over me. In a desperate move, I swung the knife, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The creature's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with an icy, vice-like strength. I felt a searing pain as its fingers tightened, and my vision blurred. I don't remember passing out, but when I woke, it was daylight. I was lying on the forest floor, my tent and gear scattered around me. My wrist throbbed with pain, and when I looked, I saw dark bruises where the creature had grabbed me. The trail camera was smashed, the film torn out and scattered. I tried to leave, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. Every path I took led me back to the campsite. Hours passed, and as night began to fall, I realized the horrifying truth. The Watcher wouldn't let me leave. Desperation set in. I built a fire, hoping the light would keep the creature at bay. But as the darkness deepened, I heard the clicking again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Shadows moved around the edge of the firelight, and I felt eyes watching me from every direction. I was trapped, a prisoner of the forest and its guardian. The Watcher wouldn't let me leave, and I knew I was one step away from death. I had to survive, to find a way out. But as the night wore on, and the shadows closed in, I realized that surviving might not be enough. I had to confront the Watcher, to understand what it wanted, and why it had chosen me. The nights in the forest stretched on endlessly, each one more harrowing than the last. The Watcher, or the Observer, as some legends called it, seemed to grow bolder, its presence more oppressive. The clicking of the invisible camera became a constant companion, and the figure haunted my every moment, both waking and sleeping. I had to find a way to banish it, even if temporarily. One night, I recalled an old legend about the Observer. The story spoke of a symbol, an ancient rune said to ward off evil spirits. I had seen the symbol etched into a tree on one of my hikes. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. Determined, I set out to find that tree. The forest felt alive, shifting around me as if trying to lead me astray. But I was fueled by a mixture of fear and determination. After hours of wandering, I found it. A gnarled old oak with the rune carved deep into its bark. I copied the symbol onto a piece of paper and returned to my campsite. As night fell, I drew the rune on the ground around my tent, hoping it would provide some protection. The forest grew darker, and the familiar clicking began. The shadows danced at the edge of the firelight, but this time, they couldn't cross the line of the rune. The Observer appeared just beyond the symbol's boundary. Its eyes glowed with malevolence, its mouth twisted into a grimace. It reached out, but an invisible barrier held it back. For the first time, I saw something like frustration in its dark eyes. The rune worked. The observer was temporarily banished. I knew I didn't have much time. I needed to find a permanent way to stop it. The next morning, I set off deeper into the forest, searching for clues about the observer's origins and weaknesses. The tales I had read hinted at a forgotten temple hidden in the heart of the forest, a place where the spirit had been bound long ago. The journey was arduous, the forest dense and unforgiving. Strange things began to happen. Whispers in the wind, shadows moving just out of sight. At one point, I stumbled upon an old graveyard, the tombstones covered in moss and vines. One gravestone stood out, larger and more ornate than the others. It bore the same rune I had used to banish the observer. Curiosity piqued, I approached the gravestone. As I brushed away the dirt, I uncovered an inscription. Here lies the guardian of the forest, bound by ancient rites. Disturb not his rest, lest you awaken his wrath. A chill ran down my spine. I had to be close to the temple. I pressed on, the forest growing denser and darker. Hours later, I found it. A crumbling stone structure covered in ivy and hidden beneath the canopy. The air was thick with an ancient energy, and I knew I had found the source of the observer's power. Inside, the temple was dark and foreboding. The walls were covered in strange symbols and carvings depicting the binding of the spirit. At the center of the temple was an altar, and on it lay a large ancient book. As I approached, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see the observer, its eyes burning with fury. It had found me. With a guttural growl, it lunged, but the rune around my neck, hastily drawn in desperation, held it back. We were at a stalemate. I had no choice but to confront it. "Why are you haunting me?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the stone chamber. "What do you want?" The observer didn't speak, but its eyes told a story. Images flooded my mind. A time long ago when the forest was sacred and protected by ancient guardians. The observer had been one of them, bound to watch over the forest for eternity. But something had gone wrong. The guardian had been corrupted, its purpose twisted. The book on the altar held the key. I opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages until I found the ritual that had bound the observer. It spoke of a way to cleanse the spirit, to release it from its torment. But the ritual required a sacrifice, something of great personal value. I knew what I had to do. With trembling hands, I placed my camera, my most prized possession, on the altar. As I began the ritual, the air grew cold, and the observer screamed, a sound that shook the temple to its foundations. The runes on the walls began to glow, and a light enveloped the observer. Its form twisted and writhed, the dark energy slowly dissipating. With one final, agonizing cry, the observer vanished, leaving behind a sense of peace and silence. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, but relieved. The forest felt different now, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. I knew I had succeeded, but at a great cost. My camera, the tool that had brought me so much joy and solace, was gone. I left the temple, the sun breaking through the canopy as I made my way back. The forest no longer felt threatening, and the shadows no longer hid secrets. I knew the path out now, and I walked it with a sense of closure. But as I reached the edge of the forest, I felt a familiar chill. The wind whispered through the trees, and I turned to see a figure standing at the tree line. It was not the observer, but something else. A reminder that the forest held many secrets, and some were not meant to be uncovered. With a heavy heart, I left the forest, vowing never to return. The stories I had learned, the things I had seen, would stay with me forever. And though I had banished the observer, I knew the forest would always watch, always wait, for those who dared to disturb its ancient peace.